Let me get to the point about sex slavery. A good book I recommend is Lawrence Keely's War Before Civilization. He explains that pre-modern war was primarily about manpower. The side that had the largest army was usually going to win, and if you had too few people, this made you an easy target for a larger group to attack you and wipe you out. This meant that women were very valuable in pre-modern societies because your society's ability to reproduce and build up the population is limited by the number of fertile wombs you have. Keely says, and I quote, "Although the loss of even a large percentage of males will have no direct influence on a group's demographic fortunes, the loss of or gain of fertile women can mean the difference between population decline and growth." This is why Keely argues all pre-modern civilizations took sex slaves. Again, this was a necessary aspect of war. If you did not take concubines, you were at a major disadvantage militarily because you either take concubines or your people get wiped off the face of the earth. There is no third option. So given that stark reality, yes, taking sex slaves was not only morally justified, it was morally necessary. And really, that's enough for the argument, but it's worth noting that the Sharia's rules on concubines and slaves in general are the most humane out of any other civilization. Again, slavery is not supposed to be a fun time, but Islam explicitly gives slaves many rights. They can't be mutilated, they can't be killed, they can't be prostituted. For women, if she gives birth to her master's baby, the baby is free, and she also is freed automatically when her master dies. These rules ensured that captured slaves very quickly integrated within larger Islamic society, especially after 1 or 2 generations. Contrast this with other societies in history that maintain a permanent subjugated slave class based on race or ethnicity. Islamic slavery is not like that, and that's why we see, for example, the Mamluks in the Middle Ages, who were a ruling class of Muslim slaves and the descendants of slaves, some of whom even reached the level of sultans and emirs in the Muslim caliphate as slaves. So the argument is very simple, Harris, but you haven't responded to anything that I've said. All you're doing is gish galloping, bringing in everything except the kitchen sink, misrepresenting straw man, and I think the audience sees that. I have a very simple argument. Sharia preserves marriage and family and community and the human race overall, and I'm bringing statistics, objective statistics, that if you think that family and marriage is not valuable, then say that. Say that you don't think it's valuable, so we know. But otherwise, I'm bringing objective arguments, and you haven't responded to any of my questions.
Pick it over for a 5-minute response.
Yeah, he still hasn't responded to that. Like, I don't know if he just didn't understand the argument, but again, like from a utilitarian perspective, utilitarian morality, which presumably he and other atheists and liberals accept, you have to take slaves, sex slaves, when you conquer people. In the pre-modern world especially, you have to do that. Otherwise, you are going to be at a significant disadvantage that will lead to your extermination, your people's extermination. That is, a lot of harm that's caused by you not taking sex slaves. So that's why it's a standard policy. That's a standard policy where you have wars in the pre-modern period. And Lawrence Keely talks, actually, if you look at Lawrence Keely, what other people are doing, non-Muslims are doing in wars is far more barbaric than anything that Islam allows. You have people in pre-modern wars who are cannibals, right? They're cannibals in the sense that they will start eating the defeated tribe or the defeated people. They will eat the heart, or they will eat, parts of their bodies, the dead corpses. Actually, this is we see the Mushrikeen doing this in the Battle of Uhud. After the Battle of Uhud, also, this also happened where the Mushrikeen were eating parts of Hamza, radiallahu anhu, or biting at least his heart. So this is a practice that many of these mushrik people, pagan people, all these different tribes, they would even engage in cannibalism, torturing just for the sake of torture. Like, you've defeated the people, but you just want to torture the women and children, and you want to, cause as much pain and suffering, this kind of brutality. Islam does not allow any of this. Like, it's explicitly prohibited. It's explicitly prohibited in Islam to just torture people for the sake of torturing them. You can't just mutilate bodies. You can't engage in these cannibalistic actions. All of this is prohibited in Islam. And according to the the majority opinion, you can't even attack any non-combatant. You can't attack any children. You can't attack any women, old men. You can't attack monks. You can't attack rabbis. You can't do that, according to Sharia. So this is, again, like just principles. War is inevitable. Islam is a realistic religion because it's grounded in reality and truth. War is inevitable. But how are you going to engage yourself in war? What kind of rules of conduct are you going to abide by in war? And certain things are justified morally and other things are not justified morally. Cannibalism is not justified. Torture for the sake of torture is not justified. Like what the U.S. forces do all over the world, where the U.S. thinks that the entire world is its playground. The entire world is its brothel. Their soldiers go and rape and kill and molest. These things are under the secular, democratic, liberal, enlightened West. These things are happening. I don't see Haris Sultan crying any tears about that. I don't see Haris Sultan even acknowledging it. Even when I bring it up in this debate, he's saying that, oh, these are isolated incidents. Like I'm the sadist, but this is the cold-hearted response he has when I'm bringing up all of these atrocities and war crimes. Islam is very clear. Like, it's by statements of the Prophet ﷺ himself that are recorded. So you can't say that this is Muslims just inventing something for the sake of looking politically correct and enlightened. No, look at our books, look at our fiqh. We have these kinds of humanitarian rules, these rules of justice in war. But war is necessary. War is necessary, and in those situations, in the pre-modern period, slavery was necessary, morally necessary. You have to, otherwise you're risking annihilation. And sex slavery was necessary, otherwise you're risking annihilation. Come up with a counter argument. Explain to me what's the problem with this argument? Okay, Apus and Harris and other atheists, they want to take these selective clips from the debate and say, oh, he supports sex slavery, look at this barbarian, without actually putting the argument in its entirety to misrepresent basically what I've said. But put the whole clip, put the whole 5-minute segment so that people understand, and then provide an argument to counter it. Harris, obviously, he couldn't do that because he can't think. The poor guy can't think. Well, now you have time to sit and think about it, and you can make an argument and show why this is not a practice that was justified in the past, even though all of these people practiced it. All these civilizations, all these peoples practice it. You don't take the women of the conquered tribe. If you don't take them, what is going to happen to them? What is going to happen? They'll die, okay, or they'll be invaded by other people. Other people will come and take all of these women and children and either kill them or enslave them. Or the women and children can be left, alone to fend for themselves. How long do you think they're going to last by themselves? Even in the modern period, if a lot of people make this argument, if today all the men disappeared in the world and only women and children were left, how long do you think that they would last? Even with all the technology that makes life so convenient and easy. Well, the power would go out pretty soon because the electric grid, it's men who are doing the job of maintaining the infrastructure of the country. So your power, your clean running water, your gas pipelines, all of this would be gone within a week, maximum a week, but probably way before that, maybe the first day, the first hour maybe, depending on where you live. So no electricity, no water, no transportation. You can't use your electric car, your nice little Tesla, to drive to the grocery store. You're not going to have gas for your nice minivan to drive to the grocery store, go to the restaurant. You can't use your phone because it's not charged to order Uber Eats, and who's going to even drive that Uber Eats to bring your meal? Netflix is gone, so oh my God, that's going to be a big problem. And what else? Like, how are you going to get your food? What about all of the agricultural industry, all the shipping, all the truck driving? All of that is men. They're all dead. So how long are you going to survive in the modern world as women when that happens? A day, 2 days? When is the food going to run out? And a lot of people make this argument nowadays because it's so obvious the answer. All of these strong, independent women, it doesn't matter how strong and independent women are. You know, I'm not a misogynist, but let's be real. Let's be real about the facts. No matter how strong and independent you are, these women aren't doing these jobs. These jobs are 99% male dominated. Men are keeping society afloat all over the world. This is not like a Muslim, non-Muslim argument, because Muslim countries are the same exact thing. It's the men. Women, yeah, you're a strong career woman who can do an office job. You can do a white-collar job. But you can do many service jobs. But can you do the hard manual labor of just sustaining the infrastructure of a nation, of a city or a neighborhood? Can you do that? And I think we all know the answer to that. So now imagine 500 years in the past, 1,000 years in the past, 2,000 years in the past. What are those women going to do? The men have been killed in war, in battle. They've been killed. So what? Are they just going to... I can just imagine like a liberal mind thinking that, well, those women should be, you know, just respected and be, you know, given equal status in society, and they should just be living free. And but this is nonsense. This is nonsense. You have to coerce. You have to coerce those women to integrate into your society, or you can just leave them to die. You can leave them to die. The imam, as I mentioned, can make that choice. He can say that we're not taking any concubines. We're not taking any slaves. The imam can choose that. He's basically sentencing them to death. He's sentencing them to death. So it's either death or you come with us against your will. And now we have to integrate you into our society. You see this over and over and over again in history. And even non-recorded history attests to this, because according to, again, evolutionary biologists or some of these historians, anthropologists, they look at DNA. They look at DNA and they see certain patterns in the DNA when they analyze the chromosome of different peoples, and they can tell a very interesting historical picture of how people of the past, how population, this is population genetics, how populations differed over time. And you can see genocide literally in the DNA. You can see that in certain societies, because of this DNA record, there's no written record, there's no historical record, but the DNA shows that this society was, all the men were killed and only the women were preserved. And the conquering men kept them were mating with them exclusively. And the men of that conquered civilization was completely wiped out. So, and then the other point that I make about the difference between Islamic slavery and other types of slavery is that there was no permanent slave class. So you enter as a slave because your people were conquered. You were part of the people that were conquered. But your children are not necessarily going to be slaves. And your grandchildren are very unlikely that they'll be slaves. Your great-grandchildren are very unlikely to be slaves. They'll be equal members of society, most likely. This is very unique. This is another way that Islam is very unique compared to other civilizations, because other civilizations, the majority were ethno-nationalists. Like you're a specific ethnicity, like the Han Chinese, and you're just dominating other non-Han Chinese. And the women, yeah, you're taking the women as sex slaves, but they're always going to be sex slaves, and their children are always going to be sex slaves because that's their ethnicity. And if there are children, because sometimes they just killed any children that were born, or they forced abortions, right? And if you're mixed, like you're half Han Chinese and half these conquered women, then you're also slaves. You're not pure blood. So you have this permanent racial slavery that you find ubiquitously throughout these other pre-modern societies. But Islam says, no, this is not. We want to integrate. These people that are conquered, we want to integrate them as fast as possible. Why? Because Islam is this beautiful religion. Islam recognizes realities. Islam recognizes what is going to lead to human flourishing. I explained this. Someone in the comments I just see saying, oh, I find so much of this extremely disturbing. Like, this, do you find war disturbing? Like when you read about all of the battles of history, all of the wars of history, even according to like American history, when they're teaching American history is very bloody. Even by their own, like these are the winners, America, that's telling its story, like standard in grade school. You had the founding forefathers, these very noble, enlightened men who wanted freedom from the tyranny of King George III. And they, there's the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and this and this. It's like war after war after war. Basically 90%, I think it's literally like very close to 90% or more of America's history has been America engaged in war. But even according to like the national consciousness, this kind of patriotic consciousness, war is good. War is in the sense that it's necessary. It's something that you have to engage in for right and truth and justice and freedom and equality to rise to the top, right? For the good guys to win. Isn't this the premise of every single Marvel movie? Every single Marvel movie or every single superhero movie or literally every single war movie, it's all glorifying war and violence. But that's just seen as normal, but that involves killing and death and brutality and shedding of blood, bombing people, especially modern warfare. It's extremely, extremely bloody and violent. But you don't bat an eyelash at that. You don't bat an eyelash at any of that, and even though it's very horrifying. So just reflect on that when you think about these heroes, whether they're fictional or actual historical figures. They're engaged in killing and murder. I mean, killing and violence, but it's seen as justified. It's seen as taking someone's life is justified. So if that's one level, then what about other things that might be justified as well? Other actions that are actually less violent than killing. Less violent than killing, which includes, having a concubine, having sexual relations as a necessary aspect of war. And this is what, I argue in the next 30 minutes or so. But just logically, if you think about that and compare, what is so special about sex and that kind of relationship? Like, Muslims aren't Victorian Christians. Okay? We don't have that same kind of view of sexual relations as being inherently dirty. We don't have that view. We are created by God. Allah has created human beings with certain capacities, and one of those capacities is to have sexual relations, and part of it is for reproduction, and part of it is actually for pleasure. There's nothing shameful about it when it's done in the permissible ways, and there are certain ways that's permissible and certain ways that's impermissible. One of the ways that's permissible is with milk yamin, those that your right hands possess, the concubines and There's nothing shameful about that. There's nothing shameful about that for the reasons that I outline, for the reasons that I explained. This is something that's necessary. It's something that leads to a lot of good outcomes. And if you, like, your mind is just like, oh my God, this is so, it goes against freedom and equality and all of these liberal principles, or it's just like, it's not something that you're familiar with and it's foreign, and therefore you have this kind of reaction. Okay, well, there are a lot of things that you might not be familiar with that other people, 99% of people, had no problem with. Just like you have no problem with slaughtering in war. You have no problem with that. In fact, you glorify it. You watch movies about it. You read books about it. You have songs singing about it. You're just familiar with that, and you're not familiar with another aspect of war and conquest and these things that existed for 99% of human history. So, yeah, logically. And then sex, right? Sex. These liberals are so like, sex is worse. This is the implication of what Harris is saying. That, and he actually explicitly says this later, like, being a slave is worse than being killed. That makes no sense according to utilitarianism, according to maximizing pleasure. Because if you're still alive, then you still have a possibility of gaining more pleasure. Your overall utility still has a chance of going up as opposed to dying. Especially dying painfully, like through nuclear warfare or through bombs or chemical warfare. So even according to utilitarianism, you should prefer to be a slave as opposed to just being wiped out, let alone your entire people be wiped out. So it's logically incoherent from that aspect, but from another aspect, being a sex slave, on the liberal mindset, they often criticize Muslims and say, oh, Muslims are so, or Christians as well, Christians and Muslims, you're so prudish. You're just a bunch of prudes. You have to be free. Just have sex and enjoy life, and don't worry about getting married. You can just sleep with anyone. It's just a beautiful, sex is just like any other bodily function. Why do you have all this taboo around sex? Just, be a hippie. Smoke some weed and, hook up. Drink a beer, hook up, just enjoy life. Sex is just another bodily function, like eating food. Like eating a hamburger. Eating a taco. Smoke some weed, eat the taco, have sex. It's all just life, man. This is the liberal mindset. So if sex is just like eating a hamburger, according to liberal, free-thinking, woke people, then sex slavery just means like forcing someone to eat a hamburger. So tell me, like, what's so significant? You're forcing someone to eat a hamburger or to eat a taco. So, like, there's so many contradictions with your philosophy, your liberal philosophy.
We'll kick it over to Daniel for his 5-minute response as well.
Okay, so I'm going to address slavery and sex slavery, but let me just be explicit for the audience, since Harris doesn't seem to be getting it. I'm arguing that Sharia law is superior to human rights because Sharia rule preserves marriage and family. Okay? And human rights doesn't. It destroys marriage and family and community and the human race. That's the argument. So let's move on to slavery. The reality is, to win a war in the pre-modern period, it was all about manpower. The main factor in whether your people would live or die was numbers. So this meant that if you won a battle, you couldn't just let the captives go because they would just regroup and attack you again or join your enemies. So you only had two options. You either had to kill or enslave. Neither option is good, right? But that's just the nature of war. You always have to use violence against the other side. You either kill or enslave. So Harris, you want to criticize Islam and call Islam barbaric for having slavery, but imagine if I asked you this question. Do you support using weapons in war? Do you support using guns to shoot people or swords to stab people and kill people? Do you support that? Because all of that is violent. All of that is barbaric. Presumably you'd say, yeah, of course I support weapons and killing, because how else are you going to fight war and defend yourself? Well, that's exactly the point with slavery. In the pre-modern period, you couldn't have war without slavery any more than you could have war without weapons and killing. In other words, if killing people can sometimes be justified, then slavery can also sometimes be justified. And this is exactly what your friend, apostate prophet, accepted with open arms in our debate last year. Imagine in the future they invent a new technology for war where a laser shoots from space and can directly target any person in the world. And the technology is so precise that there are zero casualties other than the intended target. Then people in this future might look back at our time and say, look how barbaric those people in the 21st century were. Look how barbaric with their tanks and guns and bombs. Would that make any sense? That's exactly what you're doing by criticizing Islam for slavery. You should just acknowledge that slavery could be completely justified in certain circumstances, which, by the way, are the circumstances people have lived in for 99% of human history. Now, if you want to argue that Islam requires enslaving people today, I would say that that is not correct. It depends on the imam. If you read fiqh, Islam...
So before we get into the modern period, I just don't understand how anyone can dispute this. Like, it's... even like I'm using a purely utilitarian argument. It's a purely utilitarian argument. It can also be an evolutionary argument. It could also be like a cultural evolution argument that if you believe in evolution and cultural evolution and evolutionary psychology, presumably Harris believes, well, actually he called it all riffraff. All of the academic references are just riffraff. But for those who are atheists or they're not religious, presumably they accept a utilitarian argument, an evolutionary psychology argument. Cultures are going to engage in behaviors that are adaptive, and what's most adaptive, what's going to be the kind of behavior that leads to the most good, or the most utility, or allows that community to survive over other communities, then those behaviors will propagate, and then you have this kind of cultural evolution explanation for why certain behaviors come into human nature over time, or human cultures over time. And taking slaves is one of those behaviors, is one of those things that, according to evolutionary psychology, conflict itself is inherent to human nature. I mentioned Jonathan Haidt, like having this kind of in-group versus out-group mentality. All human beings have it. And sometimes it can be a source of destruction or evil, and sometimes it's wholesome and necessary. And, you know, it depends on the situation. But, like, for example, racial in-group, like thinking that you're better you're better than someone because of the color of your skin or where you were born, that's evil, right? But having a loyalty to those who share your beliefs, having loyalty especially to those who believe in God, who believe in truth, who follow the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is al-wala wal-bara. Al-wala means loyalty to the Muslims, to the loyalty to Allah, loyalty to His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, loyalty to the ummah, to the believers. This is important. It's valuable. It's praised. It's a sign of iman, of having true belief, and it's also something that's inbuilt. Okay, this kind of instinct, and bara, disassociation, and like we don't prefer, or we're not going to prefer those who disbelieve in Allah, disbelieve in His Messenger, or even worse, they fight against Allah, fight against His Messenger, defame Islam. We're not going to have a kind of affinity for those people, or we're not going to prioritize those people and put them as our role models or our spiritual role models or people above us in terms of being our, awliya, or our wali, in terms of walaya. So we're not going to do that. That's what bara means in a nutshell. But this is also something that is found within human nature. What was the point that I was making? In group, out group. Yeah, so even on a utilitarian basis, slavery is justified because the consequences of not taking slaves is going to lead to less utility, less pleasure for more amount of people. That's the utilitarian argument, and I laid it out. But Harris can't acknowledge that. None of these atheists can. Actually, Apus acknowledged it. Apus, to his credit, he had to own the fact that on a utilitarian argument, slavery is actually justified historically. So in the past. But then what about present day, where we have all this technology? Then slavery is not justified, right? And so that's the argument that I addressed next.
Islamic jurisprudence, this is very clear. There's no requirement that people captured in war are enslaved. This is discussed in classical fiqh books. For example, Bidayat al-Mujtahid by Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. Go to Kitab al-Jihad, and he summarizes the position of the 4 Sunni schools of fiqh. The Imam has the option to pardon people and forego taking slaves in war. The Imam does not have the option to suspend, for example, hudud punishments for lashing, like lashing for fornicators. But taking slaves is one of those issues where the Imam can forego if it's in the best interest of the Muslim community. So in modern times, a hypothetical Imam could exercise this option and still be 100% consistent with the most strict understanding of traditional Islamic law. Now, Harris, since you seem to be ignorant about these details about...
So I'm trying to make the distinction between hudud. So had, to apply the had, the Imam doesn't have the prerogative to suspend the hudud and say that, okay, we're no longer going to lash the fornicator. We're no longer going to, cut the hand of the thief. We're no longer going to have these punishments. We're no longer going to collect zakat. We're no longer going to establish salah. These different aspects of the Sharia that he doesn't have the prerogative to suspend those things. But when it comes to taking slaves, when it comes to, for example, certain siyasi decisions in siyasa, meaning politics, like for example, who to have treaties with. Like, are you going to make a treaty with this country or that country, or go to war with them? The Imam has the decision. Like, he can make the decision to attack a country, to not attack a country. Sorry, I'm just plugging in my phone, which is dying here. Those are decisions that the Imam can make. He can decide to do so or to not do so, depending on different considerations that he has. So this is an important distinction to make between siyasa versus hudud. And overall, Sharia is so much more than just criminal punishments and corporal punishments. But these murtaddeen and these atheists, these liberals, this is all they want to talk about. This is all they want to focus on. They're giving this message to the world that Islam is just about slavery and sex slavery and wife beating, and this is all that Islam is about. This is why, this is another big reason that they're con men, because they're distracting people from all of the benefits of Islam, all of the beauty of Islam, and all of the things that Islam offers that are actually direct solutions to the evils of the modern world. All of the problems and the dysfunction and decay of the modern world are addressed so beautifully in Islam, because Islam is from the Creator. Islam is genius, brilliance from the Creator for the benefit of all of humanity. So you can't have a straight up argument. You can't have a straight up debate about that. You have to constantly derail into slavery, sex slavery, wife beating, because that's all you have is like this shock value type of gotcha type of argument where you confuse people and you distract them from these clear positives. So I don't think it's actually effective in debate to try to gloss over slavery, to gloss over wife beating, to gloss over hudud. Or jihad, like jihad al-talab. Don't gloss over those, but you have to have good responses. If you gloss over it, the non-Muslim thinks, okay, this is just another apologetic, excuse-making, cucking, which we'll talk about in a second. This is just, you're embarrassed by this aspect of your religion, so you're trying to circumvent it and avoid the topic. It's very clear. Like, people can sense that. And they're not going to take you seriously. It sounds like you're hiding something from them. You're not showing the real truth. Islam is just like every other false religion. And we don't want to be religious. We want to be free-thinking, liberal individualists. So this is why it's necessary. Like I prepared to with him, I prepared with Apos to talk about these topics, and I teach about these topics as well in Alesna Institute and elsewhere, because you need to address it. Like why, if Islam is so moral and it's truly the religion of God, the Creator, how could it have something as immoral as slavery? How can this be a prophet of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad, when he has slaves himself? He eventually freed, but he had those slaves at one point. He had the concubine at some point. So isn't that, how can he be a prophet? How can he be the peak of morality? This is the shubha, this is the doubt that lingers in the mind of not only non-Muslims, but also Muslims, some Muslims. And you have to address it in a very clear, rational way, using argumentation that appeals to people's understanding and their level of understanding of morality, which nowadays is a utilitarian kind of morality. That you can make a historical argument, you can make a psychological argument, you can make a utilitarian argument, and then they'll have a hard time disputing that or refuting that. And for many it makes sense, like inshallah it makes sense for people, and then they get over it. They realize that Islam is a religion for every aspect of life, not just when you're sitting comfortably with your family, but sometimes life involves war. That's human nature. That's the way that God has created. Allah has created us as human beings in this dunya, on this earth. Sometimes there's war, sometimes there's conflict, sometimes there are battles, sometimes there are crimes, sometimes there's theft, sometimes there's depression, sometimes there's famine. Islam, the beauty of Islam, the genius of Islam, is that it gives us guidance for all of these dimensions of life, the good and the bad, the easy and the difficult. This is the beauty of Islam. Other religions, they don't have this. They literally do not have this. So you have to appreciate Islam and recognize its divine origin, its divine nature. Christianity doesn't have this. You know, I don't want to create some kind of, make this a Christianity bashing session, but Christianity doesn't have many of these aspects of guidance about how to live life, because it's just the nature of Jesus, peace be upon him, alayhi salam, as a prophet. Like, he was not the final messenger, he is the Messiah. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. His time is coming in the future when he will return from heaven to once and for all kill the Antichrist, once and for all establish the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's coming. That's coming, inshallah. But his time on earth was limited because he wasn't the final prophet. So he wasn't married. So how are you going to get guidance for how to be married and the rules and regulations for marriage, the rights and responsibilities for marriage, all of these moral values that will dictate a healthy marriage according to God, when there is not an example of that, a divinely guided example of that, whose example has been preserved so that future generations can also implement it and learn it and practice it and imbibe it. Jesus was never married. He had no children. So how can you have and his teachings also, how much of it is dedicated to specific, tangible things about children, like raising children, inheritance, such a huge aspect of life. When you die, how are you transferring your wealth to the next generation? Can you just decide to do whatever you want with your wealth? Yes or no? Can you just say, I want to give all my wealth to this guy because I hate my kids. I'm giving all my wealth to my friend Bob. Can you decide that? Is that your right or is that your child's right? What amount of your inheritance is due to your children, to your parents, if they're still alive, to your spouse? What percentage of your inheritance? This is significant. And another thing that non-Muslim academic sociologists recognize is that the way that you have inheritance distributed has a huge effect on family structure and the way and society overall. Because if you are going to this actually happened in the Christian church. Like the Christian church tried to manipulate people's marriages because they outlawed what they considered incest. And one thing that they considered incest is cousin marriage. But not just first cousins. According to the Catholic Church, even if you're second cousin, you can't marry your second cousin. You can't marry your third cousin. You can't marry your fourth cousin. You can't marry your fifth cousin. And on, like up to the seventh cousin. They consider this incestuous, which is very extreme because almost all cultures accepted cousin marriage. Because when we say cousin marriage, it doesn't just mean first cousins. It means like with your second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin. This is something that we find in most societies historically. But the Catholic Church, for one reason or another, said, no, we're not going to recognize these marriages anymore. As Catholicism spread in the Western Church spread throughout Europe in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, up to the 8th century, they had basically had this entire policy of no cousin marriage throughout Europe, and they would penalize you basically because you'd be excommunicated from the church. And if you're excommunicated from the church, obviously your inheritance when you die will be confiscated. So that has a big effect where all this money is going to the church. All this money is going to the church because people have their personal private wealth, and for whatever reason they've been excommunicated or they've had some other violation, or they've been told that if you give your inheritance, all of your inheritance to the church, then God will forgive you, or whatever policy that was actually implemented by the church and disseminated by the church. All of that money goes to the church. It gets very powerful. But other things suffer because your children who could have benefited from your wealth, this generational wealth, they're going to be poorer. They're going to not have as much wealth. All of that work that you did to build up your wealth, your personal wealth, your children won't be able to benefit from that, or it'll be limited because of the inheritance policy. So anyway, long story short, this inheritance has a big effect on society. Who can give us guidance? You need God's genius. You need God's knowledge. You need God's knowledge to know the best distribution of inheritance for the benefit of society, the benefit of not just present society, but future generations and what is going to happen in 1,000 years. No human being can predict that. No human being can calculate and take into account all the different factors for the correct distribution of inheritance. It's God only, the creator of human beings, who has that knowledge, the all-knowing creator, the all-powerful creator. So you have inheritance rules in the Quran, explicitly in Revelation. How do you distribute your inheritance? God has commanded it. That's also something that cannot be suspended by the Imam, by the way. It's required that you abide by that. And if you don't abide by what God has commanded in terms of distribution of wealth, then you're in disobedience to Him, and it's a major sin, obviously. So we have to appreciate Islam. We have to appreciate Muslims. We have to appreciate the Sharia, this beautiful system that we haven't even gotten close to appreciating what we have in Islam. Some of us. I'm not talking about ulama and awliya who do appreciate it, but many of us, I'm talking about myself, have not appreciated the beauty and the amazingness of this ni'mah, this blessing of Islam.
Islamic law, I'll do you a favor and steelman your argument for you. You could respond to me and say, well, Daniel, fine, slavery could be justified in the past, but now with modern technology, modern weapons, clearly slavery could never be justified. That means Islamic rules regarding slavery are not justifiable in our modern context, which means at least one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete, and if one aspect of Islamic law is obsolete due to modern technology, then why not all of Islamic law? This is actually the argument that a lot of Muslim liberal reformists make, but the response to this is simple. In the past, the low level of technology meant that in order to wield political power, war was necessary, which meant that slavery was necessary. The only difference today is there are bombs, nukes, fighter jets, drones, chemical and biological weapons. So now war is not about manpower. Basically, you have to believe that these new technologies are such a blessing, and we're better off because at the very least, no one needs slavery to defend themselves, right? We live in a world of nukes and drones and weapons of mass destruction, so slavery is no longer needed. So the question is this actually a better world? Well, the harms associated with modern technologies like nukes and drones and mass surveillance, and you can't go to the bathroom without security agencies constantly monitoring your every move and every communication, these harms are far, far greater than the harms that existed in Islamic slavery. Frankly, these modern technologies are more terrifying. We have to look at the whole package. Which is the better world? One with the constant threat of nukes, nuclear annihilation, and constant terrorizing of the world's poor people with trillion-dollar weapons programs? Let's ask the people of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or the Vietnamese children with horrifying birth defects because of chemical weapons like Agent Orange. Let's ask the Palestinian and Syrian refugees or children who are being burned alive with white phosphorus. In light of these modern technological horrors, the practice of Islamic slavery actually seems a far better alternative in the context of war, even if it were practiced today.
Thank you very much. 5-minute response from Harris. Go ahead.
So, hopefully this argument is very clear. Like, even if, because I already made the point about the imam. So, an imam in modern times, maybe he doesn't want to implement taking of slaves, taking of concubines. That's his prerogative. Like, he can decide that in modern times. Like, if a situation arose where Muslims are fighting again and we're under the khilafah, legitimate khilafah, and we have this Islamic nation, war can break out, and then those practices of slavery, they're as relevant and as important as before. Then the imam can decide of taking slaves or not, or whatever. He has the prerogative based on maslaha, based on what he thinks is best. And this is in line with the most orthodox interpretation of Islam. All of the fuqaha acknowledge this right. And look in the books of fiqh, usually under Kitab al-Jihad. Kitab al-Jihad or in Bab al-Jihad, you'll find exactly this point. So it's not like a modernist attempt to be apologetic. But, okay, fine. Put that point aside. Even on the most extreme interpretation, like this kind of stupid, ignorant interpretation that someone like Harris might have, that no, Islam is about taking slaves all the time and fighting jihad all the time. Okay, fine. We'll address even that argument. We will steelman your position and even argue against that and say that, okay, fine. The only reason slavery, taking slaves, is something that is necessary, morally necessary, because of the previous argument that I just gave. Like, it's a matter of life and death for your people. You'll be wiped out if you don't take slaves and sex slaves. But technology has gotten rid of that necessity, because now we have bombs. Wars are no longer about manpower, having the biggest army. Wars are no longer about having, the most men fighting for you. Now you can have one drone operator who is able to wipe out an entire village. One drone operator sitting 1,000 miles or 3,000 miles away. So it's no longer about manpower. It's just about this technology. But unlike, these liberal progressives, we have to recognize the harms of technology, the horrors of technology, the cost. What is the true cost of technology? Because that's the two options, right? You either have low-tech society with slavery as a necessary part of civilization, and 99% of civilization practiced all of these things. Or you have high-tech, modern warfare with your B-2 bombers, etc. So which one do you choose? To make a rational choice, and even a utilitarian choice, a utilitarian materialistic choice, you have to weigh all of the harms, all of the cost. But these liberals are not willing to do that. These progressives are not willing to do that. They're not willing to look at the whole package. If you did look at the whole package, like just Google right now on your phone or on your laptop, Google Vietnam birth defects. Look at Google Images. I'm not going to show it because then this video could be taken down because they're so horrifying. Okay? Vietnam birth defects. Look at Iraq birth defects, Fallujah. Even actually, these Google Images right now, it looks like a lot of them are. These are not even the most horrifying pictures. Google might have like wiped or is censoring some of the pictures because it's just, this is what they did to children. Okay, using Agent Orange, using napalm, using these chemicals in war, that they just, showered the Vietnam jungle with these chemicals. And look at what they have done to humanity, to children. You're so concerned about women being enslaved, Harris, in war. Okay, fine. Talk about concubines, but also talk about the mothers of these children. Yeah, it's gonna be hard to look at, but look at birth defects from Fallujah, Iraq, just 15 years ago. America bombing using dirty weapons. Dirty meaning they have radioactive material in the armaments. So when they bomb the Iraqis, they're spreading this kind of radioactive nuclear waste. Like, imagine the kind of... Only an atheist can drop a nuclear weapon. Only an atheist human rights activist can drop a nuclear weapon on a person, or a nuclear waste, radioactive material. Only an atheist. I mean, Allahu Alam. Maybe that's too strong of a statement. Maybe, but it's a good question. Like, even mushrikeen, there hasn't been a... Maybe, I don't know. Maybe my statement is too strong. But the development of nuclear weapons, the development of chemical weapons, that is on the backs of the materialist, atheist liberals. That's a historical fact. They're the ones who are promoting science at all costs, progress at all costs. They're the ones who are promoting this unhinged, non-stop technological advance, no matter what the consequences. It's not Hindus, right? We have to be fair. We have to be fair about this. It's not Hindus. It's not pagan, tree worshippers. It's these liberals. They're the ones who developed these technologies. So we have to be fair about that. But people like Harris are not going to own up to it. They're not going to admit that they have this kind of blood on their hands.
Right. No, slavery wasn't abolished because of the modern day warfare. Slavery was... The reason that we don't have slavery is because the Enlightenment forced us to realize that owning other human beings is not a good idea. Now that is just the outcome of that. Anyway, I always used to wonder, how could people believe in...
That is not true. Many Enlightenment thinkers were pro-slavery. So you are factually incorrect. Man, these headphones. This book right here. This book, it's going to be mirrored. Liberalism, a Counter History. Okay. Domenico Lesordo. He's Italian philosopher. Read about it. Read about all of the liberal thinkers who were pro-slavery. Or they were pro, colonial domination. And what is essentially enslaving a population of savages so that you can enlighten them, bring them to the light of reason. Read about the history, even American history. Like, you had the Civil War, right? And though people will disagree, was the Civil War, American Civil War, really about slavery, or was it about states' rights? You can have that kind of debate, but clearly there were many liberals, liberal in the sense of they were enlightened thinkers, enlightenment. They appreciated Enlightenment values, the importance of freedom, liberty. Right? Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson, the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these inalienable rights. He was a slave owner. And he had sex slaves too. He had sex slaves too. So what are you talking about, Harris? Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these forefathers who established, the greatest free nation of history, they didn't have a problem with slavery. They were practicing slavery. They only started having the real history. I've been meaning to write this paper for so long, this essay, because I've done a lot of research on the question of slavery. But the real history of slavery needs to be understood, because the West, what is actually the reason for their opposition to slavery? These Enlightenment thinkers who were practicing slavery, they were practicing colonialism. What was the real reason that they had a problem with slavery? And I'll give you a hint. It was the fact that they wanted to one-up Muslims. Like, they wanted something against Muslims, especially North Africans. They had a problem with the fact that Muslims were enslaving whites at that time in the 19th century. And they were very frustrated by the pirates, the Barbary pirates, taking Europeans as slaves. Basically, the Muslims were capturing these Europeans who were coming into their territory in the Mediterranean Sea and close to the African coast. They were taking these European slaves. Sometimes they would ransom them back to Europe. But this became a huge frustration for Europeans, the advanced European race. So it was, I'm not going to give the whole argument here, but just to give you the summary in a nutshell, they basically they were losing that competition with Muslims. They were getting beaten at their own game, basically. And so they rage quit. That's the summary. Europe rage quit slavery because they were losing. They were losing to Muslims. And this has a very interesting there's a lot of historical evidence for this that I've researched. So one day, inshallah, this paper will be published, and we'll see. You can evaluate it. Maybe I'm way off base and I'm just talking nonsense, but you can evaluate it and we'll see, inshallah.